So conference is sponsored by Oasis Open. What do? They're setting the standards for open. Read it myself. Collaboration. It has an open project. I gotta aim this way. The Open Cybersecurity Alliance is a project in the Oasis Open. It's an open project. Anybody who wants to can join. Hopefully most of you here know about it. If you don't, please join it. And its objective is to make standards-based interoperability cybersecurity a reality. Over here in your talking. So I'm going to turn this guy on. Your mic more center. Hold on a second. We'll do some adjustments. Or you can just not use the there it is. That's it for volume. Yeah. All right, good. And then a piece of the Open Cybersecurity Alliance that I'm involved in is the cybersecurity automation sub-project. You heard in the previous opening keynote about how the importance of cybersecurity automation, and that's basically where this whole group that we're getting together and have been talking about for a while gets together. So the name of this used to be the Cybersecurity Automation Village. We've evolved it, and we'll hear more a little bit more from the next speaker. We're now calling it the Interoperability Village. But I still have stickers available from the Cybersecurity Automation Village. So we've renamed it. This will be your last chance to get these stickers. So I'm going to leave them. I'll leave them right up here on the front desk. Anybody wants some can take some. Those are the final stickers from this the old name. Now, what is this group? This group started because we realized that we had a bunch of disparate standards groups and open projects and open source projects going on that actually would work much better together than independently. So a number of years ago, well, actually, why I should back up. So why does it matter that we do this automation? What's good about it? This is a slide that started in an organization or one of these similar conferences called IACD quite a number of years ago now, like 10 years ago. And the original slide, which is underneath here, was a little complex, so I tried to make it a little bit simpler. It was the people at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, the people who protect our nuclear weapons, among other things, do a lot of work in cybersecurity. Some of them are present in the room. And they did studies on how much automation could help. And it basically many orders of magnitude increase in how effective you are. And the more important thing, so I decided to reduce it even further, is basically they take out attackers 2 orders of magnitude faster, so in hours instead of in weeks. And so that's the value we want to do this, and you heard a lot about that in the previous talk. So we started putting together, hey, how do these different organizations, how do these different piece parts, if we actually implement them, how do we work together? And this is a slide from, again, one of the earlier versions of these talks. And we'll go into, in the lightning round, explaining the alphabet soup of all the acronyms that are on here, but I'm not going to do that. I do have plenty of time and could do that, but that would take away from what I'd like to do is give a little bit more of the history of how we got here. So way back a long time ago, the OpenC2 group, which you'll hear more about in the lightning talks, had some plug fest to try and get the open source associated with their particular work on standards, sort of the different organizations in it getting to work together. The CTI technical committee, people who make sticks and taxi, were doing similar, and they had again, their own set of plug fests on hey, how does their stuff talk together. And back in, you couldn't claim that the history goes even further back than in 2020. But in 2020, or actually late 2019, we sort of said, hey, if you have this threat information, you want to do something with it. You want to use the OpenC2 to do the actions. So maybe we should talk to each other. And we had different people that were in common between the different groups. And in particular at the time, Cyber Command, the NSA was whole, but in particular the Cyber Command portion of the NSA, was very interested in getting these groups working together. So they said, hey, why don't we have a plug fest and try and make a use case a little bit bigger than just the OpenC2 people saying, hey, I can send commands to something, or the CTI people saying, hey, I can generate some threat information to share. Why don't we put them together and make a use case where you actually take a real life case. In the particular case that we did back in 2020, it was the Denver airport. So it was a hypothetical attack on an airport. and looked at from the big picture of the attacker viewpoint, how would you use these tools to put them together? We started putting together not just, sticks and taxi and OpenC2, we started putting in some of the other rest of the alphabet soup that we'll explain later. And we had the very first one of these was a physical only meeting. We literally planned for about 20 people to attend, and about 40 people signed up, and we get a new room. It was quite a success. And we said, hey, this is sort of a good thing. Well, let's do it again. We ran into some issues with weird diseases that were flagged around at the time, so we were a little bit slow getting around to the next one. But we then had a totally virtual, we figured out how to do it totally virtual, and associated with an Oasis conference called Borderless Cyber, we did a second one. And the particular focus of that one was on a use case we call Compliant Connect. And that is, hey, you have a new device, you're connecting it to your network. Shouldn't you sort of make sure something about it, what state it's in, and based on what state it's in, you need to change the rest of your security around it. So for example, if it's a untrusted thing being brought in, will maybe increase your monitoring a little bit, or maybe you don't even let it in because it doesn't have the right stuff in it. Following year, we had another one of these. It was associated with a conference in New York called Tech Transfer Days, or TTD. And again, we were looking at the Compliant Connect. Or at this point in time, the whole software transparency was heating up. There was a lot of issues there, and software bill of materials, the sort of, hey, knowing what software you have, how vulnerable is it, does it have licensing issues, etc. How does that play into the Compliant Connect command? So we sort of focused that particular conference on that particular day. Then again, approximately a year later, here in the DC area, very nice facility AT&T has downtown. AT&T hosted again, one of these villages, which the names evolved somewhat over time. We sort of adopted the village name because the village is at least usually used in DEF CON and B-Sides and RSA. A village is usually focusing on a particular area where you have some talks, you have a workshop, you have a plug fest, you have sort of all these things combined. So we're calling it a village from that viewpoint. We're also calling it a village because it sort of takes all of these different components or different calling them huts in the village. And so at the AT&T conference, we focused on, because again, the software transparency was particularly hot at that time. We focused on the, hey, people want these things, and we want to know what software is in there, but we actually don't know how to do that well yet. So the main focus was on creating these software bills of materials. But when we did that, we still kept all the other previous use cases. So in other words, each one of these bills on top of each other. In a given conference, we sort of focus on a particular thing, but we also sort of update it with whatever's new and how it applies into the older things. The next one that we had was in June of 2023. CISA sponsored a thing called SBOM Rama, which was basically getting several hundred people together out in Los Angeles and USC, associated with where we currently were in the state of software transparency. Again, it was a multi-day conference, sort of the day before it, threw it together rather hastily. We had, again, one of these events, and the focus on that one was sort of the next stage in software transparency. So sort of now that we have a SBOM, not even what do we do with it in the long term, just where do we hand it to, how do we actually transfer these things, because we're having a lot of what we call the format wars. We did not have appropriate standards on what should be in SBOM. And CISA had a working group that had just come out with sort of what we'll call the minimum requirements, and we're sort of focusing on the, hey, are people, how do we actually make these things, how do we put their minimum requirements in, and how do we use them even if they're in different formats. And then a year ago, in this very room, Peraton hosted the most recent one of these events. And the focus of that one was, again, we still handled sort of these previous use cases, and some of which we'll get into later in the talk. But we sort of added a new one, and the new one was Olympic Destroyer. And this was different than how we've done the other one. All the previous ones, we had done hypothetical information. We've done artificial information. We sort of went out of our way to not upset anybody by using real data. But we decided, because we had the data available, that used Olympic Destroyer. For those who aren't familiar, Olympic Destroyer was the event that happened at the beginning of the Seoul Olympics. Many people don't realize there was a massive hack that occurred literally during the opening ceremony of the Seoul Olympics. And we actually, through some of the members of this group, Jane in particular, who's here in the middle here, had access to that data. She's very involved in the sports ISAC, where they're sharing the information about, attacks on sporting events. Well, it was a pretty big attack and a pretty big sporting event. So it generated a lot of attention. We sort of used that data as sort of the basis of the kicking off. So similar to the Denver airport hypothetical, it was, no, this was a real life event. Well, how would we use that if we had all the tools in place on day zero? How do we do that if we have all our tools in place still today? Because, oh, by the way, some of the techniques that we're using that are still being used today. And then for today's event, you're going to hear a lot more later in the day about sort of the main focus is now on Volt Typhoon, and the Bowl, I'll call it Typhoon family with Salt Typhoon and Flax Typhoon, and basically the Chinese attempts to attack the U.S. infrastructure. And again, we have real data there that we'll be using, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that today. So sort of the big picture of how we got here is over time, we really started before this with groups operating independently. Then we started working on, hey, a couple of these groups should work together. And over time, we've included more and more people, more and more huts in our community, and sort of gotten to more and more concrete, how does this stuff actually work? Now, we sort of have 3 levels of how we work together. Some is, and you'll see some today, with fully automated and fancy, and oh, actually mine didn't turn on. Talk about that in a second. I was hoping that would start lighting up so we could compare the evolution of the hardware as well as software. But we start out with what we call hand waving. Yes, a vendor might have a tool that does it, but it doesn't actually have our standards in it. There's another vendor that has another tool that does the same thing. But they don't actually talk together, but they could talk together if they implemented our standards. So we call that a hand waving interface. Okay, then we sort of go to the next stage where, well, we have some software and we sort of have working with very prototyping. Then we go to the full production. You'll see some demos later today of multiple organizations really talking together with their using these standards, with their data being transferred and real events taking place. So that Raspberry Pi was supposed to light up, and that was supposed to start going, but I obviously didn't hit my buttons right when I started setting up here. But we also started interacting with a lot of the open source software that we've written to support all of these standards. And some of them were very simple. You can send a device to this Raspberry Pi with an OpenC2 command and change its quote firewall configuration. You can send a packet filtering command and say, hey, block IP address 1234. That's sort of the hello world of security. Giving demos of that is really boring because you don't see anything. So we started using blinkies. Blinkies is sort of the hello world of the IoT world, where you blink a light, and that was supposed to start blinking, but I didn't hit the right command, obviously. But it's supposed to simulate hey, we have these orchestrators, we have things that run playbooks with Kakao that we'll hear about later, that then say, hey, go change your security configurations because of the threat information that was talked about. The previous speaker talked about how you need to understand your threat environment and sort of how to tune your system. Well, the tuning of the system part you do with these command and control issues that are easier to see when you have blinking lights. So sort of we have had an evolution also over the years from a very simple Raspberry Pi lights to the next speaker we'll be talking about a much more complex setup over here. So again, the sort of evolution of how we got to where we got. How am I doing on time? 10 minutes. But that's sort of what I had to speak on how we get here. The next speaker will then talk about how we evolved from the automation village to the interoperability village, and from sort of my simple Pi to a much more fancy cloud-based stuff, so we can sort of keep this stuff in place beforehand. But I will pause here and ask if anybody's got any questions, or some people that are around longer have anything they'd like to add to what I've sort of brought to get us here.